Hey, you guys know about the ginger genocide? The ginger side? You know what I'm talking about, right? When a character that was originally white with red hair is recast as black in the next iteration of the franchise? There's tons of examples here. The Little Mermaid, Mary Jane from Spider-Man, April from Ninja Turtles, the list almost seems endless. I'm sure you've seen one of the many meme collages of this phenomenon. They get reposted every time a cartoon black person takes another cartoon ginger's job. Now, there are some people who take this very seriously, claiming that there's an anti-white agenda that's being fulfilled by race-swapping characters to be black. And to their credit, there's clearly something going on here. I've noticed the pattern, as they might say. But these people don't just notice the pattern, they immediately jump to assuming there's some kind of coordinated anti-white effort at play. While I'm sure that Hollywood in particular has more than its share of individuals who hate white people, frankly, the idea that this is all a part of the plan to exterminate the white race is kinda retarded. But nonetheless, this isn't coincidental either, so let's see if we can get to the bottom of it. One good way to discover what's actually happening here is to discover the rules of what's happening here. There's clearly a set of principles that progressive artists and showrunners are operating on when they race swap characters. Through simple observation, we've already got one rule in the bag. Rewriting ginger characters, and more broadly white characters, to be black is good. It's even trendy at the moment, but for our purposes it's more important to know that it's morally acceptable. And of course it is, it's just a character. It's kinda cringe, but I personally don't really care that much. This conversation gets a little bit more interesting once we can derive some additional rules based on further observation. Those collages show characters that are swapped from white to black. They're mostly fictional. A lot of them are animated, though most of the animated examples get race swapped after making the jump to live action. And most importantly, these are canonical swaps, meaning that it's not fan art, but it's an official adaptation of the property. So let's mess around with each of these variables and see what we can discover. One obvious one is the fictional characters thing. Are we seeing these race swaps happen to non-fiction characters, as in real historical people whose lives are being adapted into a movie or something? The answer is yeah, but it's not that simple. For example, I know a lot of these same pattern noticers on Twitter were up in arms at a black Queen Charlotte in the Netflix show Bridgerton, screaming that the anti-white agenda wasn't simply coming for April O'Neil or the Little Mermaid. Now they're trying to blackwash real history. And again, to give the devil his due, there certainly are a lot of black supremacist HYUK worshipper types who do actually believe that major European historical figures were secretly black. But you can also tell that none of these Twitter screamers have ever actually watched Bridgerton, because the point of the show is that it's explicitly an alternate history where race relations in Europe played out differently. Bridgerton doesn't claim to aim at historical accuracy, quite the opposite in fact. So, the Bridgerton case is one where even though historical figures appear, the story itself is explicitly ahistorical, giving them the wiggle room to play with those figures in an ahistorical way. But what about productions that claim to be historically accurate? Well, that leads us to the now infamous Cleopatra Netflix drama. In 2023, Netflix put out a documentary series about Cleopatra. The executive producer of the series, Jada Pinkett Smith, justified casting a black woman in the title role by saying that Cleopatra's heritage has been the subject of academic debate, which has often been ignored by Hollywood. That, plus this incredible line from the trailer,
I remember my grandmother saying to me, I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black,
led to the show being widely mocked for its historical inaccuracy. In reality, Cleopatra was Greek. The place we call Egypt was known back then as the Ptolemaic Empire, and it was founded after Greece's colonization of ancient Egypt by Alexander the Great. Though the native people were Egyptian, Alexander installed a Greek ruling class which persisted for 300 years after his death, which included Cleopatra. The Netflix Cleopatra adaptation was a critical failure, and Jada Pinkett Smith blamed those toxic racist trolls for review bombing her project, because of course she did. But we all knew what was going on. This was some race grifting nonsense, and everyone saw through it. An Egyptian lawyer even filed a lawsuit against Netflix, and while I'm sure it quietly failed in court after everyone had moved on, it was still funny enough to make the rounds back in the day as a marker of Netflix's complete stupidity, which is a topic that I've covered in depth in a previous video. The Netflix blackwashing meme originally came about due to another historic non-black figure, Achilles, being portrayed by a black actor back in 2017, but it was Cleopatra that really made it take off. If Netflix can make Cleopatra black, why shouldn't we see Netflix originals documenting the lives of black Elon Musk, or black Vladimir Putin, or hell, why not black Adolf Hitler? Well, those suggestions made for some pretty funny jokes, but they were also immediately labeled as racist by the Twitter addy. Okay, the second rule seems to be that if we're talking about real people, race swapping to black is acceptable, but only if they're considered to be positive historic figures by the progressives. Cleopatra yes, Elon or Putin no. By the way, this is the same basic reason that Google had to apologize when its AI began to generate racially diverse Nazis back at the start of this year. The AI was set to be racially inclusive and present diverse casts in the images it created, but that was set to all topics, which included Nazi soldiers. Oops. Well, what about race swapping the other way? The truth is, I can't find any instances of official black to white race swaps. I'm sure they exist, maybe I just can't remember some obvious ones, or I haven't come across them myself. But right now the count sits at a big fat 0. But even when we consider the idea, the Netflix adaptation meme once again gives us a clue. Another part of the meme is not just swapping bad white historic figures to black, but swapping good black historic figures to white. Why shouldn't Tom Hanks play MLK? Why shouldn't Ryan Gosling play George Floyd? Of course, you already know the progressive response to this, and it is embodied in Rule 3. Race swapping a black character to white is simply bad. And this doesn't only apply to real people like George Floyd or MLK. When Ryan Gosling was photoshopped as Black Panther, there was a similar online uproar. And this rule even applies to fan art, which we learned, again, through a white race swap of Black Panther. This drawing is famous online for how much salt it unearthed, and since then people have been making this type of fan art in order to constantly rustle some jimmies. This leads to, I guess, Rule 3A? Though we've been talking about official products up to this point, Rule 3 is so solid that it even applies to fan creations. What this means is, even if a progressive is handed stewardship of a property and decides to race swap a white character to be black, if you as a fan make fan art race swapping that character back to being white, you've heckin' done a racism. No, I'm not just making that up. Artists who have redrawn the black version of The Little Mermaid as white have been dogpiled online for being a bigot, even though it's literally the same fucking thing, and that's where The Little Mermaid started in the first place. A good chunk of this whole thing can be chalked up to colorism. Colorism is discrimination based on skin tone specifically, and not ethnic group. It generally refers to preference for lighter skin tones and a rejection of darker ones, placing Europeans, East Asians, and some Latinos at the top of the colorist hierarchy. Darker Latinos, Arabs, Indians, both dot and feather, and South Asians in the middle of the hierarchy, and blacks and Austronesians at the bottom of the hierarchy. We are now getting into some very radically left territory here, far beyond your bog standard Democrat voter or whatever. So I want you to understand that this next section refers almost exclusively to terminally online extremists. The leftoids who are involved in online fan communities almost universally see colorism as something that can be rectified through representation in media. To them, more official black characters is good, but blackwashing white characters is also good, and the darker the better. If you've ever seen people scream about how a fan art uses a slightly different skin color than canon artwork, even if it's obviously due to lighting, these are the people that we're talking about here. This trend was probably most prevalent around the reveal of Nessa from Pokemon, where these retards were jumping all over anyone who dared to draw her with even just a slightly lighter skin shade, leading to white Nessa becoming a meme in her own right, and even a Twitter account. And if you really want to go down this rabbit hole, way back when Frozen first came out in 2013, you had these people screaming that Frozen shouldn't be representing Scandinavian culture, but instead the Sami, a tribal people with more Asian features living in the far north of Norway. This culminated with Elsa famously being race swapped to be black, fat, and ugly. But at least this time, it was old enough that this garbage was quarantined over on Tumblr. And at the very bottom of this conversation, we find the term black-coded. This refers to characters who aren't black, usually they're an alien with a completely non-human skin color, and how those characters are claimed as black by online fandoms, and how you're a racist and a colorist and a bigot if you disagree, which is a very common refrain at this point. I went over this in my Dragon Ball video with regards to Piccolo. Piccolo is green, but this group claims him as black, because he's black-coded. I just gotta ask, what about Piccolo is black? Is it because he dressed up in street gear when he pretended to be human that one time? This brings us to Rule 4. All non-human characters are automatically black, and any fan works that present them as human must also present them as black. Here's another example. Starfire, who is another character that I covered previously, is claimed as black because she's black-coded. And yes, she was race-swapped in the live-action version for good measure. But in actuality, Starfire is an alien with orange skin, and she was based on a model from Puerto Rico. Most recently, someone drew Mina Ashido from My Hero Academia as what they called normal. She has pink skin, black eyes, and antenna because she's a moth girl. The redraw of her made her look like any other anime character, pale skin with a weird hair color. And wouldn't you know it, the internet descended on this person screaming that Mina was actually black, and drawing her with lighter skin is just racism. It really does seem like the underlying principle here is just black good, white bad, and all of the rules are simply progressive post hoc justification for their own anti-white racism. And like I said earlier, that's definitely true in some cases. But I also still think that overall that is too simplistic an explanation. It's what we call a just so story, meaning it neatly ties up all loose ends and explains all phenomenon without actually investigating anything, and also it's usually wrong. I do think there's something else going on here too. Well, let's have the details explained to us in the best possible way to transmit human knowledge, a viral Twitter thread. I've seen a lot of people make the claim that drawing a white character black is just as racist as making them white. So I'm here to explain why this is dead wrong for you. Let's talk about facts. White people are the main race represented in cartoon media to this day, while black and other POCs are not, or the representation is nothing but a racial caricature or a harmful stereotype. When your people is constantly represented in such a harmful way, or just completely removed from media as a whole, they end up clinging to characters that aren't even their race or even a person at all. So we get events like Blacktober, headcanons, and AUs of characters as black or black-coded, which are usually met with intense backlash from white people, who act as if we've oppressed them like they did us. I know a lot of you may think that when a white character is recast as black, you might say this is blackwashing and it never mattered in the first place if they were white or not. They were white just because white is the default. But when you cast a white person to play a POC character, or you redraw them as white, you are actively contributing, mocking, and taking away what little representation we have, which is why it is so clearly a big issue. Maybe go through 400 years of oppression, and then we can talk. Black edits are made out of love, and very clearly the longing to be a part of certain media, whereas whitewashing is made out of hate, spite, malice, and to anger us. Don't be a part of the people who blame us for not being represented. So let's help make these simple dreams real, and boost black creators till the gap is fixed. We need more cartoons about black wizards and knights, black love and triumph. Black stories are needed, y'all. Okay, this person could be lying about their motivations here, but for the sake of the argument, let's just take it at face value. Translating all of that from Tumblr speak, what she's saying is, the vast majority of characters are white. Representation demands that we have more black people in media, so changing white characters to be black is good, and changing black characters to be white is bad, until, as she says, the gap is fixed. Well, what constitutes the gap being fixed? I'm assuming we're talking about America here, and the most recent numbers show that black people make up about 12% of the American population, around 40 million people. Do you think that we're at the point where 12% of characters in media coming out right now are black? 12% of leading roles are black characters? Well, that's actually a pretty tough statistic to quantify, but we do have a few clues. UCLA put out a Hollywood diversity report stating that 45% of leading roles for new films on streaming services were played by BIPOC actors. That's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, by the way. Here's a second study. Inequality across 1,700 popular films. Of the top 100 films in 2023, 37 of them featured an underrepresented lead or co-lead, and within that 37, 15 of those leads were black, 39.5%. This is a noticeable increase from 2007, where only 13 of the top 100 films featured an underrepresented lead or co-lead. So it might actually be the case that black characters are now overrepresentative of the black population. If we're doing this until the gap is fixed, then it should be completely fine to whitewash black characters at this point. But, of course, a lot of these race grifters don't actually believe that. This person laid out the whitewashing versus blackwashing thing too, and they basically used basic prog punching up, punching down logic, which is simply the Marxist component of woke that I went over in my What is Woke video. The logic is that black good, white bad. Not because they hate white, as the white nationalists claim, but because they view black as desperately needing more representation, more space in the culture. I'm sure for some of them this is simply a cover story and they do actually just hate whitey, but I'm also sure that others genuinely believe this. However, I don't think it matters which belief is prominent in the end, because the same logic works against both positions. As long as people think there's money to be made, then it will happen, and as soon as there's not money to be made, then it will stop. Simple as that. This is a way more extreme example, but I think it proves my point. If we ever reached an era where, by every metric, black people were on completely equal standing with white people, all systemic injustices were solved, all power imbalances rectified, would it then be okay for white people to start using slurs against black people? Most of these radicals say no, of course not, even if they're okay with black people using slurs against white people since it's punching up, which shows that it's never actually been about the directionality of the punch, and it's always been about hating their targets. But for those people who genuinely say yes, they're carrying water for the racists in their midst, and they're too stupid to understand that the present is directly descended from the past, and the injustices of the past can never truly be solved. We can make things better now, but past injustices will always exist as an excuse for present oppression of both blacks and whites. There's one final thing I haven't addressed yet. In that long thread on why blackwashing is good and whitewashing isn't, there's a buried assumption that racist white people like whitewashing for the same reason that desperate black people like blackwashing. But is that really true? We all remember that god-awful Dragon Ball movie, right? Did anybody actually like the fact that Goku was made into a white teenager in Japanifornia? Was there even a single weird white racist jumping up and exclaiming, "Yeah, that's right, make him white, take away the representation"? Or how about the Avatar movie, or Ra's al Ghul in Batman, or the ancient one in Doctor Strange? I don't recall any white people praising these instances of whitewashing. In fact, I actually remember diehard fans complaining that the characters' races were wrong. The actual truth is that race is a characteristic that should be aligned with the story that you're telling, just like everything else in it. Sometimes that means it's appropriate to have a multi-ethnic cast, and sometimes that means it isn't. In actual history, ethnic groups became aware of their tribal solidarity at different times and places, and societies only became visibly multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan much later on. So if you're making a historically accurate Cleopatra show, then Cleopatra should be played by an actress that at least looks Greek, and not a black one. A good example of what I mean here is the game Kingdom Come Deliverance, which was set in Bohemia in 1403, and predominantly featured characters who were of the same indigenous ethnicities that were historically present at that time and place. And of course, they got shat on it by the race grifters back then too. And yes, this also works the other way around. If you're making a story where there should be non-white characters based on the time and place, and you deliberately leave them out without good explanation, then yeah, there's a decent chance that you're actually a racist, which is what made stuff like the Dragon Ball movies so uncomfortable to watch. What this all means is that representation isn't inherently bad, but it should serve the story, not the other way around. White people, black people, Asians, gingers even, it's totally fine to put them into a work, or not. But the nature of the work itself will also place reasonable restrictions on what should go into it. Complaining that there's not enough racial representation in a historic period piece, or putting that representation in where it doesn't belong, is the #1 sign that you're probably just a race grifter, and your opinions on this sort of thing shouldn't be taken seriously.